out now if you want to. Unplug your keyboard with the computer turned off. Turn on the power, and then in a few moments you'll see a BIOS message stating that the keyboard error or keyboard not detected. And what's kind of funny is the old thing where it'll say, keyboard not detected, press any key to continue. So you get those kinds of errors sometimes, but hey, they can only program so much information into the BIOS, and I guess it has to give you some kind of message. But anyway, that would be self-resolvable almost, because you immediately know what the problem is. Your keyboard's not properly inserted. Oh, by the way, here's a good practical joke for you in case you need to have some fun around the office. Not that I've ever done this, but sometimes you can go to someone's keyboard connector in the back of their computer and don't completely disconnect it. Just pull it out so it's loose in there and it looks like it's connected. And then when they turn on their computer the next time, it'll say that the keyboard's not connected, and they look back there and they say, yes, it is, and they'll chase their tail for a while, figuring it out until they realize it's in there kind of loose. Again, not that I've ever done anything like that. Another thing that the BIOS does is it looks for any other ROM BIOS. Well, wait a minute, is this like its evil twin or something? Some other ROM BIOS? The dark side of BIOS? No, this is actually other BIOS that can appear on certain kinds of cards. The most common you'll find are video. For example, remember I said that the BIOS does load some basic drivers for video so that you can at least see text instructions on the screen. But the BIOS manufacturers know that whoever makes that video card probably knows a whole lot more about their video card than the BIOS manufacturer does. So it'll pass off a ROM BIOS for the video here as well. The BIOS has got special instructions within itself after a certain point to say, okay, I've loaded all I can load up to this point, and then it will kind of take a poll on the bus, and it will say, hey, video card, do you have any BIOS for me? Yes or no? And if it does, it'll load that BIOS and kind of put it in a special holding area within its main BIOS so that it can use both of them at once. And then the other thing that it would do is it'd look for something like a SCSI device, which is a small computer systems interface, which doesn't really say what it is, but this is another kind of a storage. You can usually use that for multiple hard drives, and it will give you redundancy, or failover that is, as well as additional storage if you want it. These also have their own BIOS, and in fact, these SCSI BIOSes will also deliver a message on screen saying press Control-S or some other keyboard combination to access the setup for the SCSI, and that way you can set up a RAID array or something of this nature. Now, we talked about the CMOS a little bit earlier. Let's go ahead and go back to that. The CMOS, of course, is where we store our configuration changes from the default BIOS settings, and we can store those settings because there's a battery that keeps a constant charge on it. Here's a key thing you want to know about, and that is the passwords. This is going to be very important as an A+ exam objective. You have two types of password. One of those is user, and one of those is supervisor. Supervisor. Okay. What's the user used for? This is used just for the boot process. In other words, you turn on the power, and if a password is set for the user in the BIOS, then you have to be able to enter in that password that's been set and stored in the CMOS in order to boot the computer. If you cannot enter in that password, it never even gets to the operating system boot. It just halts right there. And so you have to have that password. Then you would also have a supervisor password potentially. You don't have to have both of these set. You could have only the user, or you can have only the supervisor, or you can have both of them set, and the supervisor is what allows you to make changes to the setup program that stores its settings in the CMOS. So I'll just put setup out here. This is where you can change the boot order and things like this. Now, just so you can identify what steps would take place during a boot process, if you had only the user password set, then you would be able to boot up the computer after entering in the user password. Then you could enter in any settings in the BIOS and make changes to the settings and store them in CMOS without the use of a supervisor password if you don't have one set. If you had only the supervisor password set, you could boot the computer anytime without a password, but to make changes to the CMOS, to the setup changes in CMOS, you would have to enter in that password. If you have both of them set, then you would have to be able to enter in either the user or the supervisor password to be able to boot the computer. In that case, the supervisor password kind of doubles as both a setup password and a boot password. Now, inevitably, you'll get someone that brings a computer into your shop, and they'll say, you know, I tried to access the BIOS settings on this computer, but my uncle was messing with the computer and set up a supervisor password, and now he can't remember what it is, or he set up a boot password for the user here. So we have a situation where we don't know what the password is, and of course, you as the technician aren't going to just automatically know it. So how are you going to get access to this computer now? Well, what you can do is a couple of different things. Number one, remember that coin-sized battery I showed you in an earlier picture? You can take that out and just leave it out for about 15 minutes. It should clear all the settings, but it will also probably reset all the CMOS settings that have been configured back to a default. And that may put you into a situation where some certain hardware in that computer or certain settings do not operate as expected anymore, and you have to go back in there and track down what they were. This is also a good reason why, if you're in total control of that computer from the time it's received in a company up until the current time, that you write down settings and you record CMOS settings so that you can always get them back to a known good state. And then just as good would be to look up the motherboard manufacturer's manual and find out where on the motherboard you'll have posts that look something like this. Usually there's 3 of them. And this is blown up. I've got a macro lens that I made quite a magnification of this so you can see it a little bit more clearly, but this is really very, very small in reality on the motherboard. And then what you can do is, using the manual, it'll identify which posts that you need to jumper. What happens is, notice that there's metal here across this gap, and this will then create a short between this metal post and this metal post, which will send a special kind of a signal back to a destination, in this case to the CMOS settings, which will probably reset them to a factory default. And included in those factory default settings is usually going to be a blank password for the user and the supervisor. And then as long as I'm here, I'll point out something about this jumper itself as well. Again, it's kind of blown up, but what you usually do is it's pretty small, and you kind of get your fingernail in this groove here to pull it up. Sometimes they're a little bit tight. I like to use needle nose pliers because a lot of times this will be located around other cables and devices, and it's really just hard to get your fingers in there. Sometimes I've actually asked my 8-year-old to get in there and grab these for me because I can't reach them. Or if I have needle nose pliers, I'll use those instead. Also, some that are easier to grab are some that have a little bit of a rise on top of them here. They have a little bit more of a tab up on top, so they stick up off of the motherboard a little bit higher, and they're easier to grab. And here I've gone to just another graphic where it shows those types of jumpers, where you can see that there's a tab up there. It's much easier for you to grab those than it is the previous type that I showed. Now then, this might not be the solution for you, because yeah, you need to reset those passwords, but you don't want to clear all the other settings back to default, because you might have taken great care in configuring all of that, and it wasn't written down in a notebook or anything, so you don't want to spend hours reconfiguring the BIOS. Well, another alternative to consider, this may not work in all cases, and it does have certain security implications, that would be to go to this website, and you can make note of it by looking in the URL up at the top of the browser here. But go here and look up these backdoor passwords. These are passwords that the manufacturers of the BIOS configure for their various BIOS. And you can just start trying some of these and see if any of these will work. And there's several different manufacturers here and so forth. So give those a try. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that some BIOS are configured so that after 3 botched attempts at the password, it'll lock you out completely. So you might not be able to go through all of these from beginning to end, so just be aware of that. But at least it's a place to start if you're in a last-ditch, desperate attempt here. And you might also be able to use these passwords if you can't access the inside of the case. For example, a lot of them might be locked. The user lost the key and they can't find it, so you don't want to take a crowbar and pry open the case or do something else destructive, so you might try one of these passwords instead to see if that'll get you in. And then finally, as a matter of troubleshooting, you might at times see something that says CMOS configuration mismatch or similar words, depending upon the manufacturer of the BIOS and the CMOS. This is usually going to be an indication that the CMOS settings have been corrupt. There might have been a power surge of some kind or a power interruption that corrupted the settings in the CMOS, or maybe a static charge might have disrupted the settings there. Provided that it hasn't ruined the CMOS, you might be able to get these settings back again by resetting the CMOS. In this case, you can't use the cheater passwords I showed you a moment ago. You would have to remove the battery or set the jumpers like I showed you earlier. Earlier we talked about the boot process and the BIOS role in that. Let's go ahead and get into a little bit more detail here, and this will all be before the operating system loads. We'll talk more about the boot process with an operating system when we delve more into operating systems themselves at a later time. First of all, I mentioned earlier that you get a power OK message to the processor. What really happens there, I kind of abbreviated it earlier, but the power supply does have a connection to a certain post on the power connector, but the power supply normally performs a rudimentary power check on itself. And if it gets a good signal from itself, then it will send a signal OK, or a power OK, to that post, and then the BIOS will receive it. Then what we have is the processor will